Okay, so I want to say a big welcome to everybody that's joined us for this webinar this afternoon. My sense is that the time will absolutely fly, so I want to be as brief as I can in terms of setting the scene, and then we can get into our discussion. My name's Andrew. I'm an Associate Director within Professional Development, leading a lot of our work on equality, diversity and inclusion, and it's my pleasure and privilege to be kind of hosting things along with my colleague and collaborator, Justine. So, Justine, do you want to say a word or two just about yourself?
I am the recently changed role actually to inclusion and community manager. So it's a broader role just to, I guess, inject some of the D&I aspects that we do internally in our organisation into the communities that we serve and where we operate. I currently work for Aldermore Bank. So yes, I have worked closely with you, Fitz, over my time with Aldermore as well.
Indeed. Okay, so looking forward to getting into our discussion. So what's also important, I think, is that we just have some briefing on how the mechanics of the webinar are going to work. So Becky, I think you can see on screen, and she'll give us a word or two on that, and then we shall get straight into our discussion.
Perfect. So just kind of the logistics of how today will work. So you will have the presentation from Fitz, that will take around 30 minutes, and then we will do the Q&A section at the end of the session. So if you see at the top of your screens here, there's a little Q&A section that you can click on. Any questions that you may have, just please feel free to pop them into there. And if you do see any questions that you like the look of, there's a little arrow that you can select, and that will vote them. And then that will allow some time at the end for Justine and Fitz to answer any queries and hopefully get through as much as we can. But yeah, the meeting chat is turned off, but if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out on the Q&A.
Okay, great stuff. Thanks, Becky. So, as I say, keep an eye on the Q&A. So tune in to the way in which the discussion, I mean, Justine and I will essentially exchange with each other over the next kind of half an hour or so, because I'm really keen that we do have some time at the end to respond to some of the Q&A points that you put in there as well. So feel free to kind of put your points in, keep an eye on that. If people are already putting in things that you're agreeing with, then upvote that. And then, as I say, we'll have some time before the end to look at that, and we'll pick on some of the most popular points that people have kind of upvoted, or if there are any others that I can see that kind of catch my eye, then I'll respond to them. It may well be that I can't respond to all of them, but I'll do my best to pick on as many as I can. So with all that said, let me share my screen, and just to give you a sense of how things will play out over the next half an hour or so in terms of our conversation. So there are three broad areas that I'm keen to consider, and what will happen is that Justine and I will kind of exchange on those, and in broad terms we'll probably spend 10 minutes on each of these 3 points. So the first of them is really about where we are at the moment. And I've got a slide that I want to use to begin our exploration of that. And I'll come to that kind of very shortly. So we're looking at what's the current climate for EDI. And, you'll all have your views and opinions on that, depending upon where you sit within your organization, to some extent, upon the nature of the organization that you're in. But we'll explore some perceptions of where we're at the moment. That will lead us into a conversation about where we think it's going, what's the future direction. Again, I've got a slide that I want to use as an illustration of where I think things are going, perhaps should go as well. Again, Justine and I will exchange on that. And then the third area, I think, is what does all of that mean for how we lead? I think that we have a key role. The work that I've been doing with quite literally hundreds of managers over the last 4 or 5 years through my work within professional development, there's a critical strategic leadership role that we play. And I think that there is real mileage in us thinking consciously and intentionally about how we do that. So again, an illustration that I want to introduce, which will set out the territory, at least as I see it. And again, that may prompt some thinking from you as well. So 3 areas that we want to get into. One is the state of play. Second is about where it's all going. And the third about how we lead. So again, welcome any thoughts, contributions, questions, ideas that you have in relation to those, either in relation to what Justine and I say, or maybe anything that occurs to you from what you're seeing in your world, as it were. Let's get into the first of those, the state of play. And I want to use a reference point here that there was a lot of discussion about, but not in relation to the point that I want to use. What you see here is an extract from the Mirror on the Industry report, which was published by Channel 4 in the last couple of weeks or so. think back to last week, there was a lot of discussion about the representation, particularly of Black and Asian people in UK advertising, and a lot of a conversation about overrepresentation. That may or may not be true. That's an interesting conversation. I think, for what it's worth, that was significantly misrepresented. This is from the same report. In fact, this is one of the earliest messages that comes out in the report. And I'm not going to speak to everything that's there. You can see there on the screen. But what's striking for me is that what it says is that actually DEI is important to the British public. 2 in 3 say issues relating to diversity, equality, and inclusion are important to them. 4 in 5 people are proud of their identity. So you might have the impression, and rightly so in some respects, that there is a climate which is moving against DEI. I think it's also important to maybe keep in mind is that whilst there might be a lot of noise in support of that, is that necessarily the majority feeling in the country at the moment? Because what this suggests, and this is but not by no means not the only report which kind of sends out that message, maybe that's not quite so. And I think there's something quite important for us to hang on to in that regard. So the noise might say DEI must die. The great public opinion might say, well, maybe it's not quite as kind of simple and straightforward as that. So that's my assertion in terms of the state of play. But Justine, let me come to you with that. What are you seeing, and what's your own feeling around where we are at the moment in terms of the climate in relation to EDI or DEI, whichever acronym we want to use?
This happens with any type of movement, right? Everything's in the spotlight, so much so that people get hung up on the terminology, but actually they don't dig deeper into how it works in theory. So what is the work going on in organisations, but also how it's moving the dial on people's individual feelings, really, and whether they belong or they feel included within their various societies. And that's here in the UK or across the pond in the US or wherever it may be in the world. When we look specifically at businesses as well, we cannot deny the facts are there are multiple studies showing that diversity and inclusion is good for business. So absolutely, we cannot argue against that, right? What's ended up happening is we've ended up in a media storm of terminology rather than actually understanding the true meaning of the work that we do. It's just a bit of a political storm at the moment. That's what I think in terms of the terminology, and what we need to do as practitioners is move more to getting people to understand the data behind inclusion and belonging and what it means for us as a society, but also for businesses, and how we can add metrics to aspects of our work rather than the nice feel-good stuff, which is raising awareness around various campaigns. But what does it mean in terms of data, the work that we do?
Indeed. No, there's a commentator on LinkedIn who is fond of using the framing of flags, food and fun that tends to kind of typify the approach to EDI that I think is it dominant? I think people are starting to move away from it. But as you say, Justine, I think that where our workers may be kind of focused on those and take those as being symbolic of the approach that we've taken, whilst it may still have a place, I think there is now more to it as well. And it's interesting talking about the way in which your role has evolved, Justine. I want to come back to that in terms of the kind of the future direction. Be good to hear some more about that. And equally, I think that there's something about the narrative and the media narrative. And what I find frustrating is the oversimplicity of the media narrative and the extent to which I think otherwise fairly reputable media outlets seem only interested in generating the polarization around the debate rather than trying to generate understanding. So much more about heat than about light. And I kind of get that. In the social media world, actually polarization sells. That's what drives attention. That's what drives clicks and so on as well. But I think it, more than doing a disservice, I think it actually creates real harm in terms of the reality of things. And it obscures, as I say, as those statistics say, actually people think this stuff matters. And I think it goes beyond the protected characteristics. While that's obviously important, and again, thinking about the current climate, I'm seeing things and hearing things that I haven't heard since I was a kid growing up in the 60s and the 70s. That is not good news. But it's equally important to hold on to, I think, the reality that, well, not necessarily everybody is thinking in that way. I think some people are moved that way because they're influenced that way, not because it's what they actually think as well. So important for us, as you say, to have the evidence, have the numbers available. Not that the evidence will change people's minds, but it's still important for us to have it there as well.
Yeah, and I think if you look at it in the most simplest of forms, right, the working population is just aging. So we're having multiple
Indeed.
generations within one team at all different levels of the business. And it's not necessarily, I say back in the day, right? Back in the day, it was somebody more senior was probably older. It's not necessarily the case now, right? There's that part. So we've got multiple generations all working together.
Yeah.
It's far easier now to just move around the world and live in any country and work wherever you want to work.
Yeah,
so you're
indeed.
really going to have to start to increase your cultural competency of
Absolutely.
interacting with people from different backgrounds and what the do's and don'ts are of that interaction as well. And the only way in which you do this is through the initiatives that ED&I, and I just think that's a buzzword, right? But ED&I bring to the table.
It's interesting because that leads us into our kind of next discussion, because I wonder whether the language of EDI, as we've become accustomed to it, I wonder how much that's going to serve us as we kind of move ahead. And again, that kind of speaks directly to the kind of evolution in your role, Justine. So interested in hearing more about that. So let me go to my second slide, because I think there is important for us, I think, to think about, well, where is it all going? And what we've done, and certainly if I think about it in terms of my lifetime, I'm thinking about 4 decades worth of experience working in this field. We wouldn't be where we are today in terms of the progress without what's happened over those 4 decades. But I think there's a real question for us about whether what we've been doing is really going to be sufficient to move us forward in future. So let me go to my slide, because I think one illustration that I've seen of this recently, which I find intriguing. And this is an example of work that is going on with L'Oreal. Many of you will be users of L'Oreal products. I'm not, but, you know, no shade on them. We're all worth it, to use their kind of phraseology. And they have introduced what they call, as you can see on the screen, For All Generations program. And you can just see at the bottom of the screen, I think, a key stat that they've identified. More than 15,000 of their employees are over 50. For them, this is really using intergenerationality, and just picking up what you were saying, Justine, as a lever. They're less of the language about ED&I and much more about how do we recognize longevity, the fact that people are living longer and therefore will have expectations about longer lives. How do we respond to that as a company? Not just in terms of how we manage our people, but also in terms of how do we reach our customers, and how do we recognize the way in which our customer base is evolving, and how to respond to that evolution in terms of producing products and services that are relevant and meet their needs as well. And so this is more than just an EDI program in the way that perhaps we've become accustomed to looking at it. This is really about saying this is the foundation for how our business is going to evolve in future. And it's interesting to put that kind of intergenerational longevity kind of dimension right at the center of that as well. Clearly, it's got some impact. If you go online, you can find more detail about it. They've got a number of themes that they're going to be rolling out and developing initiatives, all in support of this idea of For All Generations. But what this speaks to is this is about how we do business. And we need to become and to be much more visible and voluble, if I can say it that way, about positioning what we've become accustomed to talking about as EDI, not just as a kind of a marginal concern, but that's something that is absolutely central to what it is that we're doing. So that's, I think, the direction of travel. And it may well be that be interested for our guests out in the audience to maybe provide some perspective on that. How does that chime in with the kind of evolution in your role, Justine?
The evolution in my role is very much aligned to this, in that we need to understand the communities in which we operate and really who are products, who are they servicing, and how can we better serve those audiences or those customers. When I look at L'Oreal's, if we look at this in the most crude way, if we've got people living longer, we essentially have a bigger market share, right? We have more people buying from multiple generations, buying up our products. We actually could make even more money. So if we really did understand those individuals and what they need and met them where they're at, as a business, you'd be more successful, right? You can grow your bottom line if we look at it that most simple aspect. Also, when we look at, say, market share, older customers versus younger customers have obviously a higher purchase positioning. They have more money to spend, essentially. And then the workforce aspect of things, it's not necessarily a younger person that's truly going to understand what an older person will need. So therefore, we need to retain the older workforce to understand what products to develop and how in which this needs to be marketed towards the potential customer. And then you've got that twofold thing. the older customers have the purchasing power for the younger customers, buying things for their teenagers, buying things for themselves as well, teaching their teenagers, right, this is how you do this regime, etc. I'm thinking purely from a L'Oreal stance. Therefore, they're going to buy those products for their young ones.
Yeah.
So it just makes sense to understand the customer, but the starting point is that you need the workforce in which to better understand that customer. And that is what D&I is. And if you as an organisation have diversity and inclusion initiatives as a golden thread throughout your businesses, that's how you inject it into the business. And it's not a standalone piece. It should be considered at every step of the way. And there should be that kind of lens, or that person with that lens, seat in the table at all points of your business kind of ventures or goals.
Interested in how does that idea of communities play out particularly? I mean, you're a banking business, as it were. So interested just in terms of who you would recognise as communities, particularly from a kind of a commercial standpoint.
In terms of our community side of things, this is all our volunteering, this is our community giving, this may be charities that we support, but this broadens out into initiatives such as financial education. So we partner with a financial education organisation called Everfi, and we provide financial education to young people in year 12. And with that, we also provide financial education to their parents. And then we have some of our sales team actually come in the room and promote some of our saving strategies, best ways to save, products that would serve them to get them on that ladder. So that's the community piece. In addition to that, we give various amounts of funding to community projects to grow representation of various groups or communities within the areas in which we operate. So, for instance, Reading, we back a local basketball team. You know, sport is a great way to get young people interacting with each other. But there's a particular area in which we do fund is for their special educational needs sessions, and that is to give a break to the parents. We know that the caring population, especially that sandwich carer population, is ever growing, where they're caring for elderly but also caring for young people, and young people with needs is increasing as well. So we give some funding to continue those projects at a time where, you know, funding is pressured at the moment and very tight. It's not come from the government, so where can it come from? It takes organisations like this to kind of fuel that. And then the last piece there is that see it to be it. So we have a programme with business in the community whereby we invite young people into the office, because the stats say that 4 interactions with an office-based organisation or within a professional setting, it leads to a young person more inclined to go down that career route. Essentially, that grows the representation, especially for those young people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds.
Really interesting there. One, because that played into a live discussion at the moment, certainly from a UK standpoint, about financial literacy. And as a bank, there is a direct interest, it seems to me, for you in promoting that as a message. And if you're engaging with young people in doing that, whether it's explicit or implicit, you're potentially building some potential customer loyalty there as well. Because eventually those young people are going to be in market for buying banking products. And if you can create that relationship with them, there's an advantage you can accrue from doing that. So it's, again, it's really smart thinking from a kind of a basic business perspective, as well as meeting what we've traditionally thought about as being EDI goals.
It's given us great opportunity, especially the basketball team partnership, which we've started out a community savings scheme, where it's a bit like, I don't know if you remember back in the day, a partner where everybody put into
indeed, absolutely.
It's essentially the same thing, where you know, they all save together. It makes it financially viable for us, because there's more people saving into one pot, and also they're able to kickstart their saving journey, really. So these are the projects that are founded off of just getting out there in the community.
Great stuff. So I could just keep an eye on the Q&A. There's one question that appears to be kind of upvoted significantly, which I want to return to. Raphael, thanks for your question. I think that everything that Justine and I have been talking about over the last 10 minutes is a direct answer to the question. How do you ensure EDI remains a strategic priority during times of economic or political pushback? What you do is that you reinforce the relationship between what we've thought about as EDI and doing your business and good business and growing your business as well. And I think what Justine's described is a really interesting example of how Aldermore is doing that in its own way. Let me move on to that third point quickly, and then I'm keen to circle back to the kind of the Q&A as it's emerging. So the third slide that I want to share, because I think that there's a really important dimension to this discussion, which relates to how we as specialists, as advocates in this field, exercise our own leadership role. And I think that we need to be strategic and intentional about how we do that. So what I want to just kind of give a bit of a glimpse into is some really interesting research that's coming out of Harvard, the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, because they are kind of established as kind of authorities on leadership from a whole range of perspectives. What about our role as strategic leaders? In the case study coming out of Harvard, they look at the example of Tarana Burke. Now, if you're not familiar with Tarana Burke, you might be familiar with the hashtag #MeToo that had prominence a few years back. Tarana was essentially the driving force behind that. She was doing local work in Alabama, working with young girls, young black girls, who were living with the experience of sexual abuse, and developed a whole series of workshops that developed some traction. It connected with the New York Times expose of Harvey Weinstein, and that's when the Me Too phenomenon gained global prominence. But this is the woman who was behind it all. And what they explored in the case study, and again, it's really something that's worth looking up, is how did she exercise her strategic leadership role in what she was doing? And what they've identified are what they call 4 points. They call them the 4 Ps. I've highlighted 3 of those P's in this slide here, because if you look at her work, what she needed were really supreme skills in relation to people, about empathy and about harnessing emotion. She needed supreme skills around telling a story, what they call projection, telling a congruent and authentic story. She practices what she preached. There was a consistency between what she said and who she was. And then the third area was around perception, because you can imagine getting a discussion going within communities, particularly within black communities, around sexual abuse in a context where black communities are already stigmatized and marginalized anyway. That takes some serious navigation of strongly held views and concerns where you're going to have strong difference of opinion. Seems to me that that is all territory that we occupy as well. So I think in terms of how we lead, I just think that those 3 areas, people, projection and perception, provide us with a focus for how we need to develop our role. We need to be supremely skilled in building relationships with people. We need to tell a congruent, authentic, empowering, and I think a story that's grounded in success as well. And we need to be navigating different views. I think there can be a sense sometimes that what we tend to do is to preach to the choir. What we've got to do is to get beyond the choir. We've got to actually look out for those who we know perhaps aren't necessarily on our side, and start to use powers of persuasion as well as the evidence, as you were saying earlier on, Justine, to start to move people towards our point of view. Again, just touch on that very briefly. What I'd recommend is looking up that case study, because I think it really does have an interesting story to tell about a kind of a model of leadership and some areas of focus that we can develop as advocates in our role as people who are really working strategically and with intention to bring about the change that we want to see. Justine, I know you've not had a huge amount of time to just consider that. Anything that kind of strikes any chord in terms of the work that you're doing out of that kind of leadership model?
I think it is a case of what gets measured gets done, right? When I think to that case, it is taking it out of, just to your words, it's like it's not preaching to the choir. It's everybody's job, and we need to provide that education that actually we, the impacted, cannot change this on our own. We need everyone to be part of it. I think a great initiative that has worked really well. So we are part of the Women in Finance Charter as an organisation, and that is around basically getting more women into senior leadership positions, specifically on the executive board. By tracking that, you also have to develop an action plan, ways in which you are going to make this happen. And then on top of that, you have your target. Since we've been doing that, we first reported in 2022 where we had 18% of the board, Exco -1 specifically, being female. We are now at 41%. But that's because we've got a laser focus on increasing that representation. We've not taken our foot off the gas. It's everyone's job. It's worked into our executive board's scorecards, which is directly tied to their monetary pay pack at the end of the year, that bonuses, whatever that may be. So it's a business imperative, but it's also a personal imperative, right? Then when we start to delve into the inclusion, belonging, the whole feel of the business and our culture, you can directly see how our pulse surveys and our employee surveys have increased in people's sentiment towards feeling included and that they belong and they enjoy the culture of our organisation since that starting point. So one could assume that it's made a positive impact on the culture of our organisation. And this is how we use data to tell a story on the importance of diversity and inclusion initiatives, because what it boils down to, that's what it was.
What I'm going to do, Justine, is to focus now on the Q&A, because we can maybe just kind of wrap together some of the themes that we've been exploring over the last half an hour. So if I go to the most upvoted question from Olivia, thanks very much for that question, Olivia. What she says is, do you have any suggestions for an organisation looking to improve their EDI, but is facing internal pushback due to many feeling uncomfortable with the topic? One of the things that I would say would be getting some clarity upon what you mean by improving your EDI. And I think that means getting perhaps very specific about the areas of focus that are meaningful for you. I think that those areas will be very specific to you in your specific context. So that, I think, is the most important thing, because what EDI means in one part of the country, in one organization, will be different to another. And as well as taking account of what has maybe emerged over the last 30, 40 years as best practice, increasingly, it's not about an off-the-shelf solution. It's about what's going to work for you. So that, I think, is a fundamental starting point for that. The second piece relates to what we've just been talking about. Who are the people leading on EDI, whatever that means, and what's their way of working? How do they exercise their leadership role? Because it's about being able to build bridges and build relationships with people, not only those who agree with us, but equally with those who disagree with us as well. So where you got that pushback, where is it coming from? What scope is there to engage in dialogue with those, not so that you can change their minds overnight, because my experience is that's not how that change happens. Change happens person by person, and it happens when people make sense of the benefit and the value of that change for themselves. Our advocacy is to be open to the discussion and to work with those who are also open to the discussion. You may well have your bad faith actors who aren't really wanting to engage in the discussion. I would say perhaps don't choose to work with those in the first instance, but there will be others who, will have that discomfort. But part of our role, I think, is to say, well, we can't take away that discomfort, but I'm going to work with you and walk with you such that we can start to build some kind of shared understanding of the benefit of what we're talking about as EDI. And I would also say it may be that part of the future is that we talk less about EDI. It may be that we're finding different labels that relate much more to the everyday business of our organization, which doesn't mean that equality, diversity, and inclusion as topics are less important. It just doesn't become as much of a label to describe what it is that we're doing. We're able to locate it much more as part of the business as usual of the organization. So, Justine, any thoughts on that particular question?
I agree the most with the last point there, which is reframing it. ED&I needs to be a golden thread through the business, and we don't need to pin it on, that was an ED&I objective, goal, initiative. We just don't need to do that. Again, I spoke about what gets measured gets done. You need to introduce some kind of metrics around it. I think the other side of things is you have to be comfortable as an ED&I team, practitioner, whatever it may be. You cannot do everything. There are so many causes you could go after. We could talk about family and carers and ensuring flexible working, more paternity leave for fathers. We could talk about the pay gap between race and for people with disabilities. There's just so much. It's such a mountain that you just won't even do any justice if you go after everything. Also, don't get stuck in the trap of endless awareness days. That has to come back to the mission of the business or the business imperative. What we've done in particular, one of our business goals is access to affordable housing for all in the UK, and we're working very closely with the government on that. Part of that is starting to collect socioeconomic data of our customers, but also looking at the hotspots in where we operate and what those communities look like and what type of products they would need offering to them. Where do we offer those products? How do we communicate with these communities? It might not be through our website. It might actually be getting into the community and actually talking to them about some of our products and specifically how we can help them. This is seeped into our mortgage underwriting process, where it's not a computer says no, it is a human that does the underwriting for any kind of lending outcomes, so we can really assess the individual and what we can do to help the individual get that money that they're asking for. So it seeps in loads of different ways. I've pulled back on awareness days as well, so we work quite collaboratively amongst all our networks. And, you know, there's a lot of intersectionality. We would have a woman that's Black and maybe lesbian. So there's a whole cross section that she fits into. And we try to work collaboratively when we do events. So we are not exacerbating that D&I fatigue that a lot of people have with awareness days. And then it's just regular feedback. So there is a huge frequency around the accessibility angle to ED&I reports. I've made them very simple and I've aligned them to the business goals or our business line goals, but I don't pack out the report. I make sure that they're very targeted in what the business needs to know at the right time. And that's just around relationship building, having a good relationship with key members of our executive board, but also senior leaders, but also those at the grassroots of the organisation that do I guess.
I mean, what you said about metrics, that Raphael again has asked the question. It's one of the most upvoted about what metrics or KPIs are most effective in tracking meaningful EDI progress, not just representation. I mean, my sense is, 1, what do you mean by effective? 2, what do you mean by meaningful? And I think getting some meaning and some focus around those questions will, I think, lead you towards what the most informative metrics will be. In general terms, ultimately, it's going to be the metrics that drive your business that you measure the success of your business overall. And our task, I think, as leaders is to establish a relationship between the work that we do and that we promote and that overall business success. So ultimately, it's about how the business judges its success overall. And then within that, when you're looking at EDI, insofar as you're still using that as your frame of reference, again, it will depend upon the priorities that you're setting in terms of the areas of focus. So it might be about one or other identity or interest, as it were, that becomes your area of focus, and you'll develop some specific metrics that are relevant to that specific topic. That might be a fairly general answer, but I think there's at least 2 ways of answering that. But it starts, I think, again with what do you mean by effective and what do you mean by meaningful, and then developing your metrics out of that. Again, Justine, any thoughts on that?
And no, not much to add to that. If I was to give you kind of one example, one for us was around people from ethnic minority background. Fitz, you helped us out on this initiative specifically. Through the data that we collected, our people data, we noticed that the attrition of people from ethnic minority backgrounds was higher once they had a promotion, which then led us to assume that they weren't getting maybe the support they needed once they got into that promoted role. When we team that with exit interview verbatim comments, they cited, I wasn't getting the support, wasn't getting the training, my manager wasn't giving me the hands-on support to make sure that I succeed. We did this initiative where they were sponsored by senior leaders, giving that direct accountability to the senior leaders to advocate for these individuals and make them successful or put them in positions where they could be successful. And then we monitored the employee survey data following that initiative, but also we measured productivity of the specific teams that those people were in, which increased. So if your productivity as an organisation is increasing, that means you are doing better as an organisation, which can be tied back to that specific initiative, which started as attrition data, really, and telling the story with that data.
Conscious that we are reaching the end of our time together, so a couple of things that I want to say. Just want to acknowledge everybody that's put something into the Q&A. I will commit to responding to each one of those following the time that we've got here as well. So if you give me kind of 24 hours or so, I will absolutely respond to people, and then working through Becky and colleagues at Professional Development, we will find a way of being able to get back to people directly. One final message from our sponsor before we disappear, because clearly this is one illustration of the work that we're doing at Professional Development on matters of equality, diversity and inclusion. But just to give you a sense of what else is available in the product range, we have a range of programs that are available to sign up to. The strategic approaches to DEI program is one that I've been involved with for a number of years, and that's where I think we can get into a lot more of the detail that we really just kind of scratch the surface of in the time that we have. But then a number of other specific programs that are here around neurodiversity, around women in leadership that you can see there. Clearly, there's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence in the work environment at the moment, and a couple of programs that you can see there for HR and OD leaders, and also for learning and development, and then an organization development design course, all of which I think either directly or indirectly speak to the agenda that we've been addressing here in this webinar this afternoon. Just to give you a bit of a heads up, if we've caught your interest around one or more of the topics and you maybe like to follow up on that in terms of accessing a specific program of learning, here are some options that are available to, and these are programs that you can sign up to quite literally today if you so choose as well. So again, raising your awareness of those as programs. And that, I think, brings us to the end of our time. Let me just check. We've got literally a couple of minutes. So Justine, any final thoughts, literally in kind of 30 seconds, just to leave our guests with today who have been generous enough with their time to join us on the webinar today?
What gets measured gets done, and tie all your activity back to the business goals, some way, shape or form. Try and use that as the direction to take things forward, and that just puts it up a notch in terms of a business priority.
Great stuff. So thanks to you, Justine, for making the time available and bringing your experience as well. It's always great to have somebody who's out there actually doing the work as well, so appreciate that. And thanks to everybody that's joined us on this webinar. Hopefully you've gotten some insight that's been of value to you. It would be great to be able to continue the conversation in some way. As I say, I'll make a specific point of responding to those questions in the Q&A that we weren't able to get to in detail today, so at least hopefully we can find a way of continuing the dialogue there. But yeah, thanks again for your time and your energy in being here today, and all the very best with the work that you're doing in future wherever you are. But again, thanks for your contributions this afternoon.